Welcome, everybody. Welcome to First Unitarian Church, where our mission is to explore the eternal, nurture community, and pursue the common good. We welcome you in your brokenness and your wholeness. No matter who you have been, who you are, or who you are becoming, we greet you today with love. I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone who is watching us on YouTube this morning. During the prelude, please introduce yourself in the comments and let us know where you're joining from. If you're in OKC, what neighborhood are you in? Or if you're elsewhere, what city are you in? And let me introduce myself. I'm Lori Jervis. I'm a Euro-American woman with long hair. Sadly, the CDC has announced that Oklahoma County and the Oklahoma City metro area are now at high risk for COVID transmission. The CDC recommends masking indoors because of high community risk levels. So please continue to always wear your masks over your mouth and nose during and after the service. And while all are invited to fellowship in Daniel Hall after the service, because of the heightened risk, we will not be able to serve food or drinks today. And now, the prelude prepares us for worship. We light our chalice here in our building in the Midtown area of Oklahoma City on land that was home to indigenous peoples, including the Apache, Caddo, and Wichita, on land that was taken from the Muskogee and Seminole and other removed and relocated peoples. We light the chalice as a symbol of our sacred time together. The burning chalice represents the light of reason and science, the warmth of loving community, the cleansing heat of justice, and the flame of hope.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Cory Lovell. Ooh, it's a little hot. How's that? You all right? Don't want to get any ringing in the ears right out of the gates. It's a joy and a privilege to be in worship with you here this morning in this beautiful building. I stepped foot in here, and I come from All Souls in Tulsa, and it can be a little big sometimes. And this reminds me of First Unitarian Church of St. Louis, my home church. And so I walked in and was like, it felt very lovely. We enter these Sunday mornings with so many concerns and cares tugging at our souls, but we need not struggle with them alone. We are always bound to one another in a creative love that can center us and strengthen us. So together this morning we can share a moment of inmost calm that no storm may shake. Together we can go walking that ribbon of highway in this shared and sacred land.
This land is your land, this land the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. The sun came shining and I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling. As the fog was lifting, a voice was chanting, this land was made for you and me. As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said, no trespassing. It didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I saw my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me? This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
In recent years, my sense of America has shifted. Despite all of the injustices since its founding, the genocide, inequities, and cruelties, I think I somehow managed to believe in some version of American exceptionalism. While it was never fully cognized, my internalized version of American exceptionalism naively maintained that we would not experience what so many other nations have, that our democracy was secure. This belief, although not fully conscious, provided a comfortable sense of safety. I did not have to think about it. I have now come to recognize that not needing to think about it is a mark of privilege, American privilege. How I reconciled this privilege with other well-established facts about our country, including the fact that we have had a civil war, I'm not sure. Looking back, I think maybe rather than reconciling these unreconcilable facts, I simply compartmentalized them. That was a different time, a different America. So, what changed? Donald Trump and the 4 stressful years of his presidency, capped by an attempted coup and a global pandemic, and recent changes at the Supreme Court. I, like many of us, saw that we are only a few steps away from succumbing to authoritarianism, rather than it being worlds away. What I saw as a would-be dictator had made it to the White House, and it actually wouldn't take all that much to cross over into fascism. The guardrails are not impermeable. I've been trying to make sense of the times we are in, and I have to admit that on some level, I just cannot. I have, though, come to understand this country, my country, differently. Rather than inevitably withstanding the forces other nations have been subjected to, good old American exceptionalism, I now recognize how vulnerable we are. U.S. history now appears as a tenuous and ongoing struggle between the poles of oligarchy and democracy, one in which the outcome is not at all inevitable, and which relies on us, all of us, to ensure we keep landing on the side of democracy. As Benjamin Franklin proclaimed on the day the Constitution was signed when asked, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it." A republic, a government where power is held by the people and their elected representatives, not a monarch. And if you can keep it, even back in 1787, maybe especially back in 1787, Some wise souls were well aware that being able to keep it was far from guaranteed, that the republic would be challenged, that it would take continual work, that democracy is less a product than a process. The American exceptionalism I unwittingly was indoctrinated into fostered a lazy take on democracy, one in which I didn't have to do much to keep it, maybe just vote in elections and make an occasional donation to political campaigns. I now see that keeping it takes more. It takes vigilance, it takes effort, it takes a willingness to fight attempts to destroy it. Voting is just a start, not an endpoint. What is my place in this republic? What is my part, however small, and often it is pretty small, in the process of democracy? What am I, what are we called upon to do to ensure we do not succumb to anti-democratic forces? These are questions I now ask myself and hope you will ask yourself as well, because keeping it ain't easy. Okay, I guess I'm back. You just got rid of me, really. Every Sunday we take an offering. Since 2002, all the cash and designated checks from that offering have gone directly to external nonprofit organizations doing good work, our Change for Change partners. For the month of July, our Change for Change partner is Restore OKC. Restore OKC's mission is building relationships of reconciliation for restorative justice. They seek to serve the physical, social, emotional, educational, and economic needs of our neighbors in Northeast Oklahoma City. Change for Change funds will be used to support a volunteer coordinator who supervises an urban farm with paid high school students and interns who grow food, market, and sell it at the farmer's market. For those of you who are in the sanctuary with us today, in a moment we'll be passing the offering plate. If you're not able to make a gift today, we invite you to write a note of encouragement to our Change for Change partner organization, and we'll share those messages with them as well. And if you're watching us online, or if it's just more convenient for you, please make a gift by sending a check to First Unitarian. Just write Change for Change on the memo line, or make an online payment through our website, 1UC.org.
Truth is marching on. It's a Julia Ward Howe line. She's one of my favorite Unitarians. I invite you to join me in prayer. Eternal Spirit, common source of all creative good, we gather here today in thanks and praise for this ability to be together in free-thinking, open-hearted community. To open the doors not just of our church building, but of ourselves, to new ways of being and thinking that may help us endure times of trial. We pray for the healthcare workers tending to us through yet a new phase of this pandemic, and also facing new challenges to providing compassionate care. We pray for the teachers gathering up supplies and making plans for the new school year that may help our next generation find new ways to build a just society. And we pray for those in our lives who may need our love and our care and our compassion. May we hold one another as tenderly and steadfastly as we are called to. Amen and blessed be. Driving around Oklahoma, I often see images and murals of Woody Guthrie with his famous slogan taped to his weathered guitar, "This machine kills fascists." And it's tough to see that and read that, because these days fascism seems so alive and well. As the mid-20th century activist, refugee, and philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote in her Origins of Totalitarianism, we are dealing with the banality of evil. We're witnessing the same old playbook, same old lies, same old grudges, and persecutions being laid out in front of us, time and time again, trying to drag us back, sometimes a century, sometimes 2 centuries, into our past. It's like the most frustrating, tedious, and boring zombie movie you've ever seen. I've always been a man dedicated to the liberation of my fellows, anti-racism, LGBTQ solidarity, religious pluralism, the dismantling of toxic masculinity, patriarchal power structures have been lifelong pursuits that have undergirded my ministry and my movement in this world. But in so many ways, recently I've come to realize that as a man in my late 30s who's been bopping along with me, myself, and I for so long, these convictions of mine resided often in a place of mere theory. It wasn't until recently that that theory became daily practice, that I realized that unlike the glamorous life of musical resistant that Woody's slogan is portrayed as, it's actually this machine that kills fascism. It's our capacity for improvisation, adaptation, and creative love that keeps us able to fight back against this boring, terrifying tedium. I recently became engaged to a lovely woman with 6 incredible kids. Our children, and I say ours even though I'm not their biological father, but because the love we share as a family unit is powerful and sustaining and palpable, transformative even. Our children range in age from 6 to 16. 4 of the children are capable of bearing children. 2 of them so far identify as fluid in their sexuality and in their gender. And so I see now, day in and day out, in the eyes of the little humans I make breakfast for, give rides to, take to the public library, read bedtime stories to, who one day soon may be targeted and criminalized for living fully into their bodies and their sexuality, a tangible reason to remain dedicated to collective liberation. My partner recently had a serious health issue, one that brought us face to face with the ramification of Oklahoma's recent trigger laws restricting women's health care and bodily sovereignty. And thankfully, she was in the care of professionals who refused to subject her to any preposterous, invasive, and unnecessary rules. She was able to be tended to without being subjected to unjust scrutiny. But in the midst of her care, we were informed that at least 3 obstetric and gynecological health providers in the state had recently left their practices and moved out of Oklahoma to avoid having to make the difficult and defiant decisions that her doctors had. In an NPR interview, Dr. Amy Adante, an OB-GYN in Illinois, described the current landscape. Quote, "I'm scared for my colleagues who are providing care in these states where they can't just make medical decisions based on good clinical judgment and evidence, but also have to consider what is the law." I'm incredibly grateful for the compassion and bravery of the healthcare workers in the state of Oklahoma right now who are making decisions based on the holistic well-being of their patients and not on unjust or unethical laws. They are heroes. And when I saw the woman I loved and the doctors caring for her having to make incredibly painful and difficult decisions, made even more so under the oppressive weight of tyrannical laws, it was then that the full impact of our current social struggles, the crises of freedom and liberation that we find ourselves in right now in America, became truly clear to me. The recent laws restricting women's reproductive health decisions and bodily freedom, the laws stripping the freedoms and protections of LGBTQ humans now directly affect the safety and well-being of my family and my loved ones in a way that even in my most empathetic moments, my most ministerial moments, I could hardly have conceived of. They are forcing me, my family, and those around us to make decisions, to reassess codes of conduct, ethical lines that we once thought so definitive, to search inside ourselves and ask, what might we do to protect and preserve those in our care and our spiritual values, both at the same time? We're feeling the burn now, the sting. And I'm willing to bet that nearly every person in this room is, or in a short while will too. We're having to ask ourselves, when it comes down to it, what will we do? When the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade was officially made a few weeks ago, I heard many talking about how this was the first time that the highest court in the land had actually taken a right away from the American people. And if you look at it from a strictly constitutional or legislative point of view, from a point of view not tied to our aspiration of universal human rights, but to legalese, that may be correct. But if we look at American history with our spirits, our better angels, our creative love, then we must look to 1857 to the Dred Scott decision. In that case, as many of you may know, a black man who was enslaved crossed state lines into a state in which he was legally free, and then sued his enslavers for his freedom. The case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, and in a 7-2 decision, Dred Scott was denied his freedom, creating precedent that American citizenship and rights conferred in the Constitution did not apply to peoples of African descent, whether born free or not. In the controversial decision, perhaps the worst the court has ever delivered, even to this day, Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the infamous line, quote, that they, meaning black peoples, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so, in his words, might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for their benefit. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. As if it was an incidental inclination to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of another human being, instead of a deep spiritual imperative that we're all beckoned to. Only fascism can turn a covenant into a cliff note. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. One might say the same these days for the reproductive rights of childbearing peoples in America. The vote by an Oklahoma senator a couple weeks back restricting women's freedoms across state lines certainly strikes a familiar tone. The all but certain restrictions to come of anyone who dares live openly into their sexuality or gender in states rushing to strip away their right to privacy certainly strikes a sadly familiar tone. The Dred Scott decision, unpopular even in its day, all but ensured that slavery would not come to end via peaceful legislative means. The decision dictated that Black American citizenship would not be won at the ballot box, but would be wrestled away from tyrannical fascist minority via bullets. No more than 2.5 years later, after a contested election and countless incidents of domestic terror, the Civil War broke out. And I say to you honestly today that I fear with this new decision recently made, in the social and political climate of fascistic minority rule we now face, with a chronic American amnesia from the 24-hour news cycle, with a loss of faith in our institutions and a lack of courage and compassion in so many of our civic interactions, I fear we may be headed to another. I do not wish this upon us. I pray daily that we avoid it. But I also have to prepare my spirit for the possibility, not just for my ability to remain agile and resilient, to love creatively, but for my family now too. Because in these terrifying and uncertain times, in order to live honestly into my values, I have to have not just something to believe in, but some ones too. I need heroes. And thankfully, as a Unitarian Universalist, I'm flush with them. People like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a Unitarian minister in Massachusetts, a contemporary of Theodore Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Higginson was a lover of poetry, and for a time exchanged letters with a young Emily Dickinson, celebrating and encouraging her writing when almost no one else was. He was a fierce advocate for women's rights, working for women's suffrage almost a century before it became a reality. He was also, before 1860, an anti-war activist, protesting the Mexican-American War, rallying for pacifism. He was the quintessential Unitarian. But as the times about him became more turbulent, as the fight came closer to home, his values called him into a new way of living. After an altercation with armed slave catchers attempting to forcibly extradite a free Black man from Boston down to the southern states, Higginson was wounded, nearly killed, slashed across the face with a sword meant for his throat. He stared the banality of evil right in the eye and saw its indifference. And so, his creative love changed him, and his activism went from theory to practice. He supported the effort to create a stronghold of abolitionism in Kansas, including financial support for Ephraim Newt, the Unitarian minister who risked life and limb to keep his Lawrence, Kansas congregation alive. Newt's church had been burned to the ground by pro-slavery militias. His brother had been murdered by pro-slavery terrorists. But Newt stood steadfast against the slaveholding fascists in Kansas and Missouri. And he could always count on the support of Thomas Wentworth Higginson and others who knew that the fight had to be waged. Higginson also supported allies beyond his religious community. He was one of the 4 Unitarian ministers who made up the Secret Six, supplying financing and arms for John Brown, the Calvinist militant abolitionist who attempted to start a multi-state slave revolt in late 1859. When the Civil War finally broke out, Higginson, once a fervent pacifist, commissioned into the Union Army leading one of the first regiments of freed black men. Higginson was willing to fight, to die, to kill even, for his values. But one need not necessarily choose combat or reciprocate violence in order to stay true to their spiritual convictions in the face of fascism. A little less than a century after Higginson came another couple of heroes. This time, fascism was raging not just in the American South, but globally as well. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, upending a liberal age. America, in the grip of the Depression, was slow to respond, especially when it came to accepting refugees fleeing the genocidal circumstances created by Nazi conquest of Eastern Europe. The United States even turned away from our shores the SS St. Louis, better known as the infamous Voyage of the Damned. And it was then that the Unitarian Service Committee recruited Unitarian minister Waitstill Sharp and his wife, Martha. Waitstill and Martha agreed to go abroad to Czechoslovakia and join an underground resistance led by Unitarian theologian Norbert Kapik. Martha at first left her and Waitstill's children quite reluctantly. Upon arrival in this foreign land, Martha was incredibly homesick, almost certain that her and her husband had made a terrible mistake. She missed her kids. She missed the safe life they'd built. But the courage she saw in the faces of those whom she was entrusted to assist in this oppressed country transformed her. She described the circumstances of organizing a transport plane of Jewish youth being smuggled out of Prague by their parents, who stayed behind to an almost certain death. She said the parents' self-control was marvelous. Smiling brightly, eyes brimming with tears, they waved at the children. And then the door of the plane was slammed shut with a finality that rocked the little group. And suddenly, we were all one large and bereft family. Waitstill would return to the U.S. shortly thereafter to fundraise and rally support. But Martha stayed on and occupied Europe, continuing to smuggle dissidents and children out for the remainder of the war, missing her own kids' birthdays and milestones, risking her life even when her friends, like Norbert Kapik himself, met tragic, horrific fates. Martha blurred lines that were once so stark for her in order to remain true to her convictions. She was moved by her creative love. And around the same time, James Luther Adams, one of Unitarian Universalism's most revered 20th century voices, actually spent time in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. Adams experienced firsthand the real-time slide from the liberal Weimar Republic era, which contributed to the world stage some of the most incredibly progressive and visionary art, architecture, music, and culture of the entire 20th century. It was the place to be, Berlin, just before the Third Reich. And he watched that slide to brutal extremist minority rule of the Nazi Party, who at its peak, we have to remember, only represented roughly 1/3 of the German body politic. Adams said of this time, freedom of association was being abolished. You keep your mouth shut and you conform, or you get your head bashed in. And at this juncture, I had to confront a rather embarrassing question. I had to ask myself, what in your typical behavior as an American citizen have you done that would help prevent the rise of authoritarian government in your own country? Decades after the Second World War, Adams had to answer that question again. The increasing intensity of Christian fundamentalists' use of violence and intimidation to achieve their political and legislative ambitions was becoming evident. Abortion clinics were being bombed, women's health care providers assassinated. The marriage of Christian fundamentalism with Confederate Nazism was becoming very clear to him. And Adams warned his seminary students about this. He told them as far back as 1982, when you are my age, you will all be fighting Christian fascists. And the next couple decades sadly proved him right. We've experienced countless acts of domestic terror, both large and small. From the Oklahoma City bombing, to the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation shooting, from the Emmanuel Church shooting, to January 6th. We're approaching a time when we may need to choose our faith and our principles or our lives, livelihood, personal safety. Because only once in a century or so do societies face such existential crises. And being spiritually resilient and emotionally adaptable is crucial to survive such occurrences. Many of us Unitarian Universalists, when living into our daily aspiration of universal salvation, however one may define it, when in our quest to remain with our hearts ever open, our arms ever outstretched, bridges ever being built, we often deny, diminish, or compartmentalize the reality of evil, greed, authoritarianism, and brutality that lie at the heart of fascist power structures. Many of us simply can't process such a framework because it's so antithetical to our sacred value set. That's why we need to look back in our tradition and seek out the wisdom of Unitarian Universalists who have come before us and confronted the full reality of evil, stared it right in the face, been targeted by it, resisted it, confronted it, and sometimes lived to tell the tale. We need to be grounded in the stories of our traditions past so we can learn from our ancestors' triumphs and mistakes. We need to be grounded in the love and community that sustains us so that we remember the humanity, remember the laughs, remember the look in the eye when we held close the people for whom we will fight and defend. Courage so rarely comes as naturally to us as compassion. Courage takes a little bit more practice and preparation. We don't actually know how we will react in times of terror or trial until we are in them. But when we prepare ourselves spiritually for the possibility of the cold darkness, we are better able to maintain our hopeful flame of bright, warm light. I want you to do me a favor when you leave here today. Think about the heroes that you hold dear to your heart. Maybe they're household names. Maybe they're just known to a fortunate local few. Maybe they're theologians, maybe they're doctors. Maybe they're long dead, and maybe they're young and vibrant and still with us. But they're people you think about when your spirit is faced with that terrible dilemma. What do I do? How do I protect myself and my loved ones and preserve my spiritual values all at the same time? I want you to find your heroes and print out a picture of them. Print out a bunch of pictures of them, all of them, and put them up around where you can see them and deliberate on them. On your fridge, in the visor in your car, on the bathroom mirror, over the fireplace, above the coffee maker. Hang them up like the way there used to be the framed photos of Lincoln or JFK, FDR, and Martin Luther King in your grandparents' house. The way we used to order commemorative plates off the TV. Hang them up like that. And do your best to continue to learn about your heroes. Learn especially their flaws. When were they too hot-headed and stubborn? When were they too quick to make sacrifices when they could have pushed harder? And when were they too slow? And what damage was wrought from their ego or their idealism? And then I want you to forgive your heroes, because they were human beings just like us. And most of all, forgive your enemies. Not just because that's what divine humanity requires of us, but that's how we'll actually live into the beloved community that we're fighting so hard for. And also because it might save our own souls too. These are tough times, but they are times that will be written about and reflected upon for ages to come. We will be the guiding light for the generations that come after us, who will be determined to maintain the freedoms in the community and the love that we struggle to ensure for them. And even if we fail more often than we succeed, if we do it with the creative love, the spiritual conviction, and the compassionate deliberation that we have in our hearts, this machine that kills fascism, if we do it with respect for each other, even respect for our enemies, and an unflinching hope for our loved ones over and above any fear of legislative or judicial consequence, then maybe each and every one of us can be heroes too on some future person's wall.
We extinguish this chalice flame, but not the light of love and community which continues to burn in our hearts.
All right, so I have one other thing I want you to do too, besides printing out the pictures. There's another thing. I invite you all when you go home to find on YouTube a performance by David Bowie from 1987 when he performed on the steps of the Reichstag building. This was the same building that Hitler set fire to when consolidating his hold on tyrannical power. And Bowie, in 1987, performed the song Heroes, just a stone's throw away from the Berlin Wall. And this performance could be heard by a crowd gathered in communist Berlin. So people on both sides heard his call to love and heroism, and it changed them. It opened them. It helped them transcend. And less than 2 years later, that wall came down, and those people lived as one. So I'm not necessarily saying that David Bowie did that, but I'm also not saying that he didn't. Our lives can flow on in endless song together above all the tumult and the strife. Go and be blessed and be a blessing. Good.